Today, we're going to try and help you change your way of thinking during your chess games. Now, I'm sure you've already heard of the phrase checks, captures, and threats, so that's what we're going to focus on today. Checks, captures, and threats refers to a thinking process meant to help players find the best moves in a complex position. When it's your turn to play, the best practice is first to see if there are any checks that you can deliver to your opponent that would also improve your current position. Now, a lot of the times there are checks that you can deliver that don't really have any viable continuation to them, so they're not really worth your time. You need to look for better moves that would give you an edge over your opponent. So, if there are no checks that would improve your position, you need to move to the second point in our list, captures. Can we capture an enemy piece? Can an enemy piece capture one of our pieces their next turn? If not, we need to go to the last point, threats. Can I create any threats in this position? Maybe creating a battery to threaten a piece, maybe threatening checkmates, and so on. The theory is easy, but the problem is applying it in your games. So let's see some scenarios that are going to help you understand this concept a little bit better. White just captured a piece on d8 right here, and is threatening checkmate on the back rank by capturing the f rook the next turn. Now, black can't recapture right away because of the same result. So rook takes on d8, and queen takes back, checkmate. So, what should black do in this situation? Well, this is where our checks, captures, and threats checklist comes in handy to help us find the best move in every position. Even if white just captured a piece on d8 and is threatening checkmate us, it's very important, especially as a beginner, not to get tunnel vision, okay? And think you need to respond to the threat immediately. First, look at the whole board and evaluate all of your options. So number one, what checks do I have here? Well, we could see three, queen to b4, queen to e2, and queen to f1. Now we see that queen to b4 right away, that's no good, because the pawn can simply take back. Now if black moves queen to e2, white is simply going to trade queens. So queen to f1, instead, white has no way to take the defended queen. So his only option would be to move to d2. Now, even if you find a possible check, you don't need to rush and make it. Think about your possible continuation for that position. And if it wouldn't improve your initial position or gain an advantage, then you need to move on and start looking for captures or threats. So if black were to check on f1, white would be forced to move his king to d2. Now, once again, we need to retool our thinking process and head back to step one. In this new position, what checks do we have? We see we've got queen takes queen, we've got queen takes on f2, got queen to e2, and we've got rook takes rook on d8 over here. So notice that knight to e4 isn't a check due to the knight being pinned by the bishop. So queen takes on f2 and queen to e2 doesn't really change our position so much, so we're going to move on to the other two options. Queen takes queen, king takes back, and now we could take the rook with a check without worrying about that back rank checkmate. But even so, is black in a much better position here? Even if he's one piece up, black is honestly in a losing position right now. His knight is still pinned, and it would be lost next turn. Black can't really defend this, and white's bishops are perfectly placed to do a lot of damage. So that's what happens when queen takes queen. But let's keep our options open, and let's take a look what happens when rook takes rook. If white would move his king, then black could capture the queen, and checkmate is going to come next turn. So white's best defense here is moving his bishop to d4. But has black finished the attack? Well, if that's the case, it seems like the first option where queen takes queen leads to a much better position for black. But wait, like I said, is black really finished the attack? Well, let's go back to step one and take a look at our checks. We've got queen to f2, queen to e2, queen to d3, queen to d1, and over here we've got rook to d4. Now we see that queen to f2 would lead to winning a bishop for white. But even so, if the black king moves, we see that the back rank checkmate threat from white has been renewed. And if black would take the light square bishop, the dark bishop would take the knight with a check, black moves his king to g8, and queen to d8, checkmate. So that plan didn't exactly work, mainly because of the bishop taking the knight with a check. So, do we have a move that will remove that bishop? Well, yes we do. It's the black rook takes bishop. even if at first it seems like a bad trade, a rook for a bishop, as a chess player you should always think of the follow-ups. And you gotta be willing to lose a few points of material in the short term, but in the long term you can gain a hell of a lot more. So pawn takes, and now we can play queen to f2 check. King moves to c1, our queen takes bishop, because the white pawn is blocking white's queen from delivering that checkmate on d8. By evaluating all the moves and playing them correctly, black has ended up 2 pieces up. Alright, let's take a look at another position here. This one, the enemy king was chased up all the way to the d6 square. Now we see that the material is relatively equal, white has a pawn up, but he didn't develop all of their pieces. It's white's turn to play, and at first glance, we see that he's got a powerful discovery check in his pocket. Let's analyze all the possible squares where the knight can jump to. We're going to exclude right off the bat the d7 square, because the king can escape through that square while also capturing our knight. So what about c6? Well, after the king takes back, white doesn't really have much of a continuation, and he would have wasted his powerful discovery check with just an equal trade. Now moving the knight to either g4, d3, or over here, c4, would lead to the king moving to e6 or blocking the check with the pawn, so again, no real benefit. Knight to f7, however, looks the most promising, because after the king moves, white would be up in exchange by taking the rook. But is this all we can get from this position? Remember, checks, captures, threats. Now we analyzed the checks part and saw that the best outcome is an exchange up. And in this position, there are no captures we could really consider. But what about threats? Does white have any move here that is going to threaten to win something much more important than an exchange? Take a look at this position and think for a minute about what white should be playing here. Now even if white has this powerful discovery attack right here, he doesn't need to play it immediately. The king is stuck between moving either to e6 or d5. Now in those kinds of positions where the king is near the center of the board, always look at ways of checkmating him or creating a mating net that would allow that. In this scenario, white can capture the pawn on f5, and with that move, now, if black makes a random move like rook to g8 to escape the fork, knight to f7 becomes a checkmate. So, by not moving the knight right away and reinforcing the attack power, white is now threatening an imminent checkmate. The best move to defend this is by playing black pawn to e6. And now we can retake our thinking pattern once again, checks, captures, and threats. And we see what moves will serve best in this position and what changed with that pawn move. Now first of all, we can see that the king has a new escape square over on e7. But by moving the queen, white now has a new square for the knight to jump to, right here, g6. And now, he would not only just be threatening to win a rook, he'd also be attacking the enemy queen. So by moving to g6, he also covers the e7 square, forcing the enemy king to move to d7. e5 is a checkmate in 3 moves, so he's not going to play that. Right? But he does move to d7. Now, even if our queen is under attack, let's go over our checks, captures, and threats. White taking the queen would put black in check, allowing us to move our queen to safety next turn. So, by analyzing all the possible moves and not rushing into playing the first move we see, we've won the enemy queen instead of winning just a rook, and that's a pretty good deal if you ask me. Alright, so I think you guys are probably getting the hang of this a little bit. Now let's look at a bit of a more complex position. It's a typical middle game in front of you, with castling on opposite sides. White is up 2 pawns, but it's black's turn, and all the pieces are pretty well placed aiming at the enemy king. Let's review our checklist once again. What checks do we have available? Knight takes on e2, knight takes on f3, and we've got a rook sack on g2. Now, checking with the knight would just lead to an even exchange without gaining much of an advantage at all. Similarly, sacrificing the rook doesn't really offer any promising follow-ups. As you guys can see, it's time for us to move on to our next option, captures. What can we capture here? The knight moves we just discussed are pretty much all worth considering, so no captures here would give us much of an advantage. Now, how about threats? Take a moment to think and let me know if you can find the solution here. Okay, so before we discuss threats, let's actually take a small jump back and see if our opponent can capture any of our pieces. White is attacking the black knight on d4 with 3 different pieces, while black only has 2 defenders. This could be an issue that we need to address. Now, let's consider the threats that we can create. Our rook is perfectly placed on a semi-open file, and by moving our queen to g7, we threaten a checkmate. White has 2 defensive moves, pawn to g3 or bishop to f1, but the situation seems pretty similar, doesn't it? White has added a defender for the g2 square, so black needs to bring in another attacker to tilt the balance in their favor again. Alright, for our final example, I'm going to make things a little bit tricky. I'm actually not going to show the moves on the board. You're going to have to visualize them. Now, it's going to be challenging at first, but with some practice, it becomes a lot easier and it definitely helps improve your games. So, we see that by moving the knight here to h4, taking the pawn, while also attacking the g2 square could be an option. However, the white knight defends that pawn, but what if it wasn't there? It couldn't protect that pawn anymore, right? So, we could take the knight with our knight, and the queen is forced to recapture, which allows us to win the pawn on h4, while also attacking this g2 square. The only problem here is that white could bring in another defender with their queen. So, is this the right move for black to play? Well, as I mentioned in the first example, we've got to focus on the entire board, not just the part near the white king where all the action is. The black bishops seem quite passive, they're blocked by their knights, but after moving those knights, the bishops can suddenly become quite a bit more active. Now, can you see where I'm headed with this? Now after we take the knight, the queen's going to take back. He's going to take the pawn over here on h4. Now even if white brings in another defender, that defender would be attacked by our knight. So he needs to find another safe square that would defend the g2 square. But which square is safe? Now if he would move to h3, the light square bishop would take it. So the only option remaining is g3. Black is attacking the white's queen with 2 pieces, but white has 2 defenders as well, the bishop on f4 and the pawn here on f2. If black were to trade queens, white would be up in exchange, even if he would have that double pawn on the g-file. But is the g3 square really safe for white? Let's take a moment and look at the board once again. Now I'm not going to make it easy for you, and I'm not going to move the pieces to help you see clearly. Try and visualize it as best as you can. Do you see it? Now if white were to move that queen to g3, he would no longer have 2 defenders as he initially thought. He would only have 1, the bishop over here on f4, because the pawn on f2 is pinned by our bishop. Remember, the knights wouldn't block the bishops anymore, so by playing those moves, white would be up a piece. Right? You see how at the first position, we were looking quite equal for both parties. Now by taking the time and going through our checklist of checks, captures, and threats, we see that the best move in this position is moving the queen to g7, creating a checkmate threat that would make white respond immediately. In order to avoid being mated, he must give up a piece. Here is the quick version of the pawn to g3 defense instead of bishop to f1. I hope you're going to apply today's checklist in your future games, and always remember to take your time and never rush your next move. Analyze your position just a little bit more, look at the whole board, and do not get tunnel vision. Now you don't need to immediately respond to anything your opponent has just played. If you can find a better move, go for that one instead. Take care and keep practicing.